Before a country lost its internet, a single human being was invaded first. No alarms, no warnings, just a very small moment when a man stared at his computer screen and felt that something was wrong. Not because the machine was slow, not because of a software error, but because of a feeling. The feeling that someone had been there, that someone had seen private things, that someone had touched a world he believed belonged only to him. It was a deeply human sensation, a quiet unease when the last safe space, a personal computer, was no longer safe. He did not know who had done it. He did not know why he had been chosen. He only knew that from that moment on, everything had changed. 1 year later, on an ordinary day in January, North Korea's internet vanished from the world map. January 9th, 2022 began like any other day for the rest of the world. No emergency alerts, no breaking news banners. But on a very small corner of the global internet map, North Korea suddenly disappeared. It did not slow down. It did not flicker. It simply vanished, as if someone had flipped an invisible switch. Government websites stopped responding. Email servers went silent. Propaganda portals that were always online now returned only cold emptiness. To international observers, this was not a routine technical failure. A country does not accidentally disconnect from the outside world. Cybersecurity experts began to speculate. Was this retaliation? A hidden message after missile tests? A quiet cyber war between powerful nations? Because in their minds, only another country could have the capability to do this. No one questioned the possibility of an individual. No one imagined a lone human being. When a nation is knocked offline, the world instinctively looks for an army. And they had no idea that assumption was about to collapse. The person behind all of this was not a famous figure, not a general, not a representative of any organization. He was known by a very ordinary name in the online world, P4X. No profile photo, no dramatic biography, just a name that quietly appeared in security research communities. In real life, P4X lived a life you would never notice in passing. A small room, a simple desk, a computer screen glowing brighter than the sunlight outside the window. No bodyguards, no teammates, no one standing behind him when things went wrong. He never saw himself as a hero. He never imagined becoming the center of a global story. His work was simple: find flaws in systems, report them, then move on with life. A silent job, almost invisible, where success is measured by nobody knowing your name. In the vast and chaotic world of the internet, P4X was just a very small individual. One human among billions, no power, no authority, only knowledge, curiosity, and a belief that doing the right thing could make the digital world slightly safer. That was why, when he became a target, he was unprepared. And he had no idea that his ordinary life was about to be completely shattered. It began in a very ordinary way, a message from a familiar name in the security research world. A shared file introduced as a new tool, seemingly harmless, even useful. For P4X, things like this happened every day. He opened the file inside a virtual environment, following procedure, following habit, no warnings, no obvious signs. But hours later, then a day later, something felt wrong. Not a system failure, not a clear malfunction, just the instinct of someone who had lived alongside computers for years. P4X went back and examined the file again, line by line, behavior by behavior. And then he saw something that made him stop for a long time. A backdoor. Not obvious, not loud, hidden so carefully that unless you knew what to look for, you would never see it. A small door quietly waiting to be opened from the outside. That moment did not feel like discovery or victory. It felt cold. A deeply human realization that a private boundary had been crossed. Someone had been inside his machine. Someone had seen what he was doing. Someone may have watched every keystroke, every thought before it became words. P4X sat still in front of the screen. He did not speak out loud. He did not panic. But one thought repeated itself in his mind. If I had not found this, how many others would not have found it either? And if someone could enter this small world so easily, then what did safety really mean? After confirming that he had become the target of a cyber espionage campaign, P4X did what any citizen is taught to do. He reported it. Not long after, the FBI contacted him. A serious conversation, proper procedure, formal questions. He explained everything he knew, every file, every line of code, every moment of discovering the backdoor. They listened, took notes, nodded. Then the call ended. There were no next steps, no technical assistance to secure his systems, no concrete warnings about ongoing danger, no reassurance that someone would monitor the situation with him. The days that followed passed slowly. No new emails, no phone calls, no updates, no sign that anyone was actively addressing the threat. P4X slowly realized a cold truth. To a massive system, his story was just another report among thousands. The most dangerous feeling was no longer the attack itself. It was the silence that followed, the feeling of standing alone before a threat you know is real, with no one beside you. No teammates, no shield, just one person, one computer, and the understanding that if it happened again, he would face it alone. In that empty space, between silence and waiting, another emotion began to form. Not fear, but helplessness. And helplessness, when it lasts long enough, slowly turns into something far more dangerous. The prolonged silence did not calm P4X. It made him angry. Not explosive anger, but a quiet, smoldering kind that built day after day. Angry that he had done everything right and still been abandoned. Angry that someone had invaded his life and disappeared without consequence. Alongside that anger came hesitation. P4X understood better than anyone how thin the line was between defense and retaliation. He knew what his knowledge could do, and because he knew, he was afraid. Afraid that taking one more step would place him on the other side. Questions began to surface late at night, when the room was lit only by the glow of the screen. If I strike back, am I any different from them? If I stay silent, how many others will this happen to? And if I go too far, what then? If my actions trigger consequences I cannot control, what then? These were not the questions of a hacker. They were the questions of a human being. Someone who understood that power, even small power, carries responsibility. P4X did not seek glory. He did not want to become a symbol. He stood before a very ordinary choice, with extraordinary consequences. Between anger and fear, between logic and emotion, P4X understood that no option was completely right, only the option he could live with. And sometimes, that moment of inner conflict is what pushes a person across a boundary they once swore they would never cross. When the anger subsided, P4X returned to what he did best. Observation. Not as an attacker, but as someone trying to understand what was really in front of him. He looked at North Korea's internet, not with emotion, but with the cold clarity of a systems analyst. What he saw surprised him. What was called the internet of an entire country was shockingly small. Just a few networks, a few dozen websites, a tiny dot on the global internet map. Not a digital fortress as many imagined, but a fragile structure patched together over years with outdated technology. Servers running old software, versions long flagged with warnings, vulnerabilities publicly documented but never fixed. Not because they were sophisticated, but because they were neglected. To someone like P4X, this was no longer theory. It was visible reality in configuration after configuration. He realized that what stood before him was not a perfect machine of a totalitarian state. It was a house of cards, built to look solid from afar, but capable of collapsing with a light breeze. The realization brought no excitement. It brought something more complex. Surprise mixed with concern. Because if a system this weak could exist untouched, the question was no longer whether it could be done. It was why no one had done it. From that moment on, everything changed. Not because he wanted to attack, but because he had seen the fragility behind a symbol of power. And once a person sees that truth, they cannot pretend they never did. After recognizing that fragility, P4X did not act immediately. He was not impulsive. He was not reckless. Instead, he returned to his familiar state, working quietly. Scripts were written, not to show skill, but to ensure precision. He knew that if one person wanted to affect a system far larger than himself, human effort alone would not be enough. Only automation could do that. He built tools so machines could do the heavy lifting. Scan, test, repeat, everything designed to function without constant human involvement. Not out of laziness, but because fewer personal traces meant greater safety. Anonymity became essential. No real name. No personal information. No one knew what he was doing. P4X did not brag. He did not tell friends. He did not seek approval or advice. Not from arrogance, but because he understood that one extra person knowing would multiply the risk. He was not blind to reality. P4X understood that US law does not allow spontaneous acts, no matter how justified the motive may feel. He knew that if discovered, the consequences would be severe. Loss of career, loss of freedom, outcomes he had never imagined. That was why every step carried heavy consideration. This was no longer a technical challenge. It was a life decision. And the most frightening part was not the risk ahead, but the fact that P4X fully understood those risks and continued anyway. That night arrived slowly. Not the kind of night associated with grand decisions, but a quiet late night, so still that he could hear the fan and his own breathing. P4X sat in front of the screen, wearing his familiar pajamas, the same clothes he wore whenever he worked alone. No ceremony, no drama, just a human being in a small room, facing a choice he had contemplated for months. Everything was ready. The script sat there, silent, waiting to be triggered. Nothing more to prepare. No one left to consult. No reason left to delay. P4X placed his hand on the keyboard and paused a few seconds longer than usual. Not from doubt, but because he knew this moment could not be undone. Then he pressed enter. There was no sound, no obvious sign that anything had happened. On the screen, status lines began to scroll, steady, emotionless. P4X did not celebrate. He did not stand up. He simply sat there, watching, waiting. Minutes passed. One website stopped responding. Then another. Familiar names on the list slowly shifted into silence. No error messages, no alerts. Just absence. P4X checked again, and again. The result did not change. Silence began to spread. Far away, servers that had always been active became meaningless. Connections once assumed permanent were severed. Not by bombs. Not by military orders, but by lines of code activated in a quiet room on an ordinary late night. P4X remained still. No smile, no triumph, only a feeling difficult to name when he realized what he had done was real. A mix of tension, relief, and a deep emptiness. The outside world had no idea. No knock on the door, no ringing phone, but somewhere on the global internet map, a void was expanding. The night continued. The room remained silent. And within that silence, P4X understood he had crossed an invisible line. There was no explosion to mark the moment. Only silence, spreading slowly and irreversibly. As the night passed and the impact widened, what happened next no longer belonged to P4X's small room. North Korea's state websites vanished from cyberspace. Not one, not two, but nearly all the few gateways connecting the country to the outside world shut down at once. External email systems were cut off. Addresses once used to communicate, to broadcast messages, to maintain an international image now returned nothing. For a government accustomed to control, it was a shock. Behind closed walls, officials began to realize something was deeply wrong. The panic was not public. No sirens, no announcements. Just hurried internal calls and anxious stares at screens that no longer responded. A system believed to be absolute control was suddenly powerless against something it could neither see nor name. Yet for most of the population, nothing changed. People woke up, went to work, continued their routines. Most had never had access to the global internet, so they did not know their country had been disconnected. The contrast was unsettling, a major crisis unfolding at the highest levels of power, while everyday life continued untouched. A nation's internet had collapsed, yet most of its people had no idea. And that silence, both online and offline, was the clearest sign that this was no ordinary failure. As North Korea's internet remained silent, the outside world grew restless. In closed meetings, on expert forums, among cybersecurity analysts, the same questions repeated. Who did this, and why? Familiar names surfaced quickly: the United States, South Korea, intelligence agencies with vast budgets and proven cyber capabilities. Many assumed this was a political message, a quiet warning following missile tests, an action only another state could carry out. No one seriously considered an individual. The idea seemed too small for the scale of the event. When a country goes offline, people look for an equal force. A machine, an army. A decision approved at the highest level. While Tealery's piled up, P4X remained silent in his familiar room. He gave no interviews, made no statements, left no trace of involvement. He read the analyses with a strange feeling, distant yet personal. The world was trying to understand what had happened, but looking entirely in the wrong direction. And in that confusion, P4X knew his silence was his strongest shield. No one was hunting him, because no one believed they were looking for a human being. As global attention faded, real questions surfaced in P4X's mind. Not about technique or capability anymore, but about consequences. In the United States, the law does not weigh motives. There are no exceptions for personal outrage, no allowance for a citizen to wage cyber war, no matter how justified the target may seem. P4X knew that a single mistake could lead to prosecution, loss of career, loss of freedom, and worse, retaliation. Yet he did not stop. The Funk Project was born, a closed space to apply pressure and expose weakness. This story does not end with an arrest. It ends with a warning. If one person can do this, what happens when there are thousands? When identity becomes data? When the internet becomes a battlefield? When war no longer belongs only to nations? And the next story begins there. In the dark corners of the web, where stolen lives are sold piece by piece.